The fluorescent lights of the Dade County courtroom hummed above a spectacle that captivated the nation in July 1979. At the center of the frantic media circus stood Theodore Robert Bundy, a former law student whose articulate demeanor and calculated charm aggressively contradicted the savagery of the charges leveled against him. Facing the death penalty for the bludgeoning murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy at the Chi Omega sorority house, Bundy rejected experienced legal counsel, driven by a pathological narcissism that convinced him he could outmaneuver the Florida judicial system. He treated the proceedings as his personal theater, cross-examining witnesses with a disturbing casualness and flashing smiles at the jury, certain his intellect could dismantle the prosecution's case. He believed he was orchestrating a masterclass in manipulation, blind to the fact that his arrogance was slowly stripping away his human mask. As the state prepared to introduce the definitive piece of forensic evidence, a deep, jagged bite mark left on the body of Lisa Levy. Bundy's carefully constructed facade was about to shatter, transforming his courtroom performance from a display of wit into the instrument of his ultimate undoing. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. To understand the catastrophe that unfolded in the courtroom, one must first dissect the intricate construction of the man who stood at the defense table. Long before he was a defendant facing the electric chair, Theodore Robert Bundy was a master architect of his own identity. His life was not a linear progression of events, but a carefully curated performance, a phenomenon forensic psychiatrists describe as the mask of sanity. This mask was not merely a disguise, but a survival mechanism, a veneer of charm and competence designed to conceal a psychological void so profound that even those closest to him failed to perceive the darkness until it was far too late. The story begins in the antiseptic hallways of the Elizabeth Lund home for unwed mothers in Burlington, Vermont, on November 24, 1946. Born Theodore Robert Cowell, his very existence was shrouded in deception. To avoid the social stigma of illegitimacy, his mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, brought him to her parents' home in Philadelphia, where a corrosive family fiction took root. The boy was raised to believe that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. This foundational lie, maintained for years, created a fracture in his reality, a disconnect between truth and perception that would define his pathology. He learned early that reality was malleable, that truth could be suppressed by sheer force of will and social presentation. When his mother eventually moved to Tacoma, Washington, and married Johnny Bundy, the young Theodore adopted the surname but never the connection. He remained an observer, a child who watched the world with a detachment that unnerved his relatives. There was the incident with his aunt, who awoke from a nap to find the 3-year-old Ted standing by her bed, smiling beatifically, surrounded by knives he had taken from the kitchen and arranged around her sleeping form. It was dismissed as a childish quirk, a singular oddity, yet it was the first crack in the porcelain shell. As he entered adolescence, the mask began to harden. Outwardly, he was a shy, somewhat awkward teenager, but privately, he was cultivating a dark voyeurism. He became a peeping Tom, prowling the neighborhoods of Tacoma, watching women undress, feeding a burgeoning compulsion for control and ownership over unsuspecting victims. During these nocturnal excursions, he learned the geography of shadows, the art of evasion, and the thrill of the secret life. Despite several close encounters with law enforcement during these teenage years, Minor interactions where he was stopped for curfew violations or suspicion of prowling. He displayed an uncanny ability to talk his way out of trouble. He presented himself as a polite, confused young man, leveraging his clean-cut appearance to disarm the suspicions of patrol officers who saw in him a reflection of their own sons, rather than a predator in the making. The true solidification of his deceptive capabilities occurred during his university years. Following a devastating breakup with a wealthy, sophisticated woman from California, often referred to in biographies by the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks, Bundy underwent a metamorphosis. He perceived his lack of wealth and social standing as the reason for her rejection, so he resolved to become the man she desired. He returned to the University of Washington and constructed a persona of academic excellence and political ambition. He studied psychology, not to heal, but to understand the mechanics of the human mind, treating his coursework as a manual for manipulation. During this period, his criminality escalated from voyeurism to theft, yet he framed these actions within a delusional sense of entitlement. He wanted the trappings of the upper middle class, the ski trips, the fine clothing, the electronics, but lacked the funds. So he stole them. He became a prolific shoplifter, walking out of department stores with stolen goods simply by projecting an air of absolute confidence. If confronted, he had prepared scripts, plausible deniability, and a smile that could diffuse tension instantly. He learned that authority figures, including security guards and policemen, operated on social cues. If one acted like they belonged, like they had nothing to hide, the human tendency was to doubt one's own suspicion. He was testing the waters, refining the ability to bend reality in real-time interactions. The most chilling example of his successful manipulation of authority during this pre-murderous phase was his employment at the Seattle Suicide Hotline Crisis Center. There, he worked alongside Ann Rule, a former police officer and future crime writer, who would later pen his biography. Bundy excelled at the job. He saved lives. He spoke with empathy and reassurance to those on the brink of despair, navigating their emotional turbulence with clinical precision. He was commended by his supervisors for his cool head and his ability to connect. In reality, this was mimicry of the highest order. Bundy felt no empathy. He was merely playing the role of the empathetic listener. He was studying vulnerability, learning exactly what words could manipulate a person's emotional state. He was receiving accolades from the very society he secretly despised, validating his belief that he was superior, that he could fool anyone, including those trained to detect psychological distress. Simultaneously, he embedded himself in the political machinery of Washington State, volunteering for the re-election campaign of Governor Dan Evans. He wore a suit and tie, carried a briefcase, and spoke with the articulate cadence of a future statesman. He shadowed the governor, recorded opposition speeches, and drafted policy memos. The clean-cut law student was the perfect poster boy for the Republican Party's youth outreach. He drove the governor's peers, attended high-level dinners, and secured a letter of recommendation from the governor himself. This endorsement was the ultimate shield. Who would suspect the polite, well-dressed law student with a letter from the governor in his pocket? He had successfully infiltrated the establishment, wrapping himself in the cloak of respectability. This era of his life was characterized by a profound compartmentalization. By day, he was the golden boy, the aspiring lawyer, the crisis counselor. By night, the entity within him demanded release. He began to stalk, to test the locks on doors, to follow women home. He was pulled over during this time for traffic infractions, driving his Volkswagen Beetle through residential areas late at night. Each time, he engaged the officers with respectful deference, perhaps flashing a campaign badge or mentioning his law studies. The officers, blinded by his presentation, sent him on his way with a warning, unaware they had just stopped a monster in Chrysalis. The psychological development here was critical to his later courtroom theatrics. Bundy learned that the judicial system and law enforcement relied heavily on stereotypes. Criminals were supposed to look rough, sound uneducated, and act nervous. Bundy looked like a Kennedy, spoke like a professor, and acted with the calm assurance of the innocent. He internalized the lesson that his intellect was his weapon and his face was his shield. He began to view the law not as a set of moral absolutes, but as a game of rhetoric and perception, a game he believed he was uniquely equipped to win. As he transitioned from theft and voyeurism to the abduction and murder of young women, he carried this arrogance with him. He believed that the same charm that fooled his mother, his girlfriends, the suicide hotline supervisors, the governor of Washington, and the patrol officers would eventually work on a jury of his peers. The mask of sanity was fully affixed, polished to a mirror shine, hiding a predator who viewed the courtroom not as a place of judgment, but as just another stage for his performance. He had spent a lifetime practicing for the role of the innocent man, and as the investigations began to close in, he was certain that his carefully constructed reality would hold against the weight of the evidence. He was wrong, but the confidence with which he held that belief was forged in these early years of successful, unchecked manipulation. The humidity hung heavy over the low country of South Carolina on the night of June 7, 2021, a thick, suffocating blanket that trapped the heat and the insects against the earth. At the Moselle Estate, a sprawling 1,700-acre hunting property in Colleton County, the silence was typically broken only by the sounds of nature or the distant baying of hounds. But at 10:06 p.m., the silence was shattered by the frantic, breathless voice of Alexander Murdaugh, connecting with a 911 dispatcher. He reported finding his wife Maggie and his youngest son Paul shot dead near the dog kennels. The call itself was the opening act of a performance that would stretch over nearly 2 years, a preamble to one of the most calculated attempts to manipulate a legal system that his own family had controlled for 3 generations. The scene that first responders encountered was nothing short of a slaughterhouse. Paul Murdaugh, 22 years old, lay near the feed room. He had been struck twice with a 12-gauge shotgun. The first shot was survivable, hitting his chest and arm, but the second was catastrophic, entering through the shoulder and neck, blowing his brain from his cranium and leaving it by his feet. This was close-range brutality, executed with high-powered buckshot. Yards away, 52-year-old Maggie Murdaugh had been executed with a different weapon, a .300 Blackout assault rifle. She had been shot 5 times. The forensics suggested she had been running, then had fallen, and was finished off with a shot to the back of the head while she was on the ground. The brutality of the crime scene stood in stark contrast to the man who called it in. Alex Murdaugh, a prominent attorney and scion of the legendary Murdaugh legal dynasty, appeared distraught, yet investigators immediately noted anomalies. Despite the carnage and his claim that he had checked the bodies, Alex's clothing, a white t-shirt and shorts, was remarkably clean, devoid of the blood transfer one would expect from a grieving father clutching his decimated son. As the investigation launched under the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, or SLED, the narrative Alex Murdaugh spun was simple and seemingly ironclad. He claimed he had not been at the kennels that night, He stated he had fallen asleep on the couch at the main house after dinner, then left the property to visit his elderly mother, who suffered from dementia, in nearby Almeida. He claimed he returned to Moselle to find the bodies. For months, this alibi was the fortress behind which he stood. The investigation, however, began to peel back layers of a life that was rapidly disintegrating. Beneath the veneer of the successful solicitor lay a man, drowning in opioid addiction and insurmountable debt, having stolen millions from clients, partners, and even the family of his deceased housekeeper. The prosecution theorized that the murders were a desperate diversion, a cataclysmic event designed to buy time and sympathy to halt the exposure of his financial crimes. The courtroom theater began in earnest in January 2023 at the Colleton County Courthouse, a building where the portrait of Alex's grandfather, the former solicitor, had hung until the judge ordered its removal to ensure a fair trial. The defense team, led by Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin, was formidable, utilizing a strategy of confusion and character. They painted Alex as a loving father and husband, a man flawed by addiction but incapable of such visceral violence against his own blood. They relied heavily on the lack of direct physical evidence linking Alex to the weapons, which had never been found. They intended to charm the jury with the image of a Southern gentleman, a pawpaw who doted on his family, wrongly accused by overzealous state agents. However, the prosecution, led by Creighton Waters, possessed a digital smoking gun that would force the defense into a high-stakes audible. Throughout the early investigation, Alex had maintained with absolute certainty that he was never at the kennels after dinner. He told Sleddy, agents, family members, and anyone who would listen that he last saw them at the house. But Paul Murdaugh had been an active social media user. At 8:44 p.m., minutes before the state believed the murders occurred, Paul recorded a video on his cell phone of a friend's dog, Cash, in the kennel run. In the background of that video, 3 distinct voices could be heard. One belonged to Paul, one belonged to Maggie, and the third voice, distinct and undeniable, belonged to Alex Murdaugh. When the prosecution played this video in court, asking witness after witness, friends, family, partners, to identify the voices, the result was unanimous. Everyone identified the third voice as Alex. The timestamp placed him at the murder scene precisely when the shootings took place, shattering his alibi of napping at the house. This revelation forced the defense's hand. The manipulation of the narrative had to shift. Alex Murdaugh, who had lied for a year and a half about his whereabouts, decided to take the stand. This was the moment the documentary focuses on, the apex of the courtroom theater. It is rare for a murder defendant to testify, and even rarer for one accused of such heinous acts against his own family. But Alex Murdaugh believed in his own power of persuasion. He had spent decades charming juries as a prosecutor and a personal injury lawyer. He believed he could charm this one to save his life. His testimony was a masterclass in calculated vulnerability and narcissistic grandstanding. When Alex took the stand, he did not look like the confident lawyer of the past. He appeared broken, his voice trembling. He immediately addressed the elephant in the room, the kennel video. In a stunning reversal, he admitted he had lied. He looked at the jury, his eyes welling with what appeared to be tears, and confessed that he had been at the kennels at 8:44 p.m. He blamed his paranoia, induced by a 20-year addiction to oxycodone, for the lie. He claimed that with a pocket full of pills and a distrust of Sled, he panicked and fabricated the story about napping. It was a strategic pivot, an attempt to use his financial and drug-related crimes as a shield against the murder charges. He was essentially saying, "I am a liar and a thief, but I am not a killer." The theatrics of his testimony were specific and persistent. He referred to his deceased son exclusively as Paul and his wife as Mags or Maggie, using terms of endearment to subliminally enforce the idea of a close, loving family unit. He rocked back and forth in the witness chair, a rhythmic motion designed to evoke sympathy and distress. He spoke directly to the jurors, making eye contact, using the folksy, relatable dialect of the Low Country, trying to establish a rapport as one of them. He described the scene of the discovery in graphic, horrifying detail, claiming he tried to turn Paul over, that he checked for a pulse, that he was covered in fluids. He cried loudly, his face contorting, yet observers noted a distinct lack of actual tears during certain peaks of emotion, while at other times the mucus and sobbing seemed performatively excessive. He attempted to derail the prosecution's timeline by drowning them in irrelevant details. He spoke at length about the dogs, about the specific workings of the kennels, about the layout of the property, trying to showcase a memory that was sharp on trivialities while remaining conveniently hazy on the crucial minutes between 8:50 p.m. and 9:06 p.m. He tried to explain the clean clothes by stating he didn't know how he stayed clean, or that perhaps he wasn't as messy as he thought, despite describing pooling blood and catastrophic injuries. The prosecution, however, was ready for the performance. Creighton Waters began his cross-examination not with the murders, but with the lies. For hours, Waters walked Murdaugh through a decade of deceit. He forced Alex to admit, over and over again, to stealing from the vulnerable, lying to his partners, and looking people in the eye while betraying them. Waters dismantled the good old boy persona, revealing a predator who used his charm to victimize those he was sworn to protect. The strategy was to show the jury that Alex Murdaugh was a virtuoso of the lie, a man who could cry on cue and convince a client he cared while stealing their settlement money. During the cross-examination, the cracks in the mask began to show. Alex grew combative when pressed on the timeline. He challenged the prosecutor on the specifics of the data from the OnStar system in his Chevrolet Suburban, which showed he had driven to his mother's house and back at speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour, slowing down near the spot where Maggie's phone was later found discarded on the roadside. Alex tried to explain these data points away with vague assertions of, "I don't recall," or by suggesting the technology was wrong. He became visibly irritated when Waters pushed him on the new story he had manufactured only after the kennel video proved his previous story impossible. One of the most chilling moments of the grandstanding occurred when Waters asked about the family guns. Alex had to admit that he could not account for the whereabouts of the 300 Blackout rifles he had purchased for his sons, the same caliber used to kill Maggie. He attempted to spin complex tales about guns being lost, stolen, or borrowed, creating a labyrinth of confusion that he hoped would cast reasonable doubt. He utilized the tactic of filibustering, giving long, winding answers to simple yes or no questions, forcing the judge to admonish him to answer the question asked. It was a control tactic, an attempt to dominate the rhythm of the courtroom just as he had dominated depositions in his civil career. He also attempted to use his status as a victim of the roadside shooting to garner sympathy. In September 2021, months after the murders, Alex had called 911, claiming he had been shot in the head while changing a tire. It was later revealed that he had hired a distant cousin, Curtis Eddie Smith, to shoot him in a botched assisted suicide plot intended to secure a life insurance payout for his surviving son, Buster, On the stand, Alex tried to frame this as the act of a man in the depths of despair, further leaning into the addict in crisis narrative. However, the prosecution used it to demonstrate his willingness to stage crime scenes and manipulate law enforcement. If he could stage his own shooting, they argued, he could certainly stage the discovery of his family. The defense team supported this theater with expert witnesses who tried to suggest that the shooter had to be much shorter than Alex, utilizing complex trajectory rods and mannequins in the courtroom. They suggested two shooters, maybe a revenge hit by drug gangs, but Alex's testimony remained the centerpiece. He believed that if he could just explain it, if he could just look the jurors in the eye and tell them he loved Paul, they would ignore the GPS data, the lie about the kennels, and the clean clothes. But the "this happened" moment, the turning of the tide, was subtle. It wasn't a single outburst, but the cumulative weight of the inconsistencies exposed by his own hubris in testifying. The jury watched a man who could recall the specific battery level of a chicken coop flashlight, but could not recall the last conversation he had with his wife minutes before she died. They watched a man who admitted to looking a client in the eye and stealing their livelihood, asking the jury to believe he wasn't doing the same to them. The charm offensive began to feel like a reptilian skin being shed. The grandstanding, intended to show a grieving father, instead showcased a narcissist who believed he could talk his way out of a double homicide. His attempt to derail the prosecution by admitting to the financial crimes backfired spectacularly. Instead of separating the thief from the killer, he fused them. He showed that when Alex Murdaugh was cornered, when the walls were closing in, he acted with ruthless self-preservation. The motive became clear. The financial storm was about to break on the morning of June 8th, with a confrontation scheduled regarding missing funds. The murders on the night of June 7th stopped that confrontation. The deaths of Maggie and Paul turned Alex from a suspect of embezzlement into a victim of tragedy, halting the inquiries into his finances for months. In the end, the courtroom theater, the tears, the folksy nicknames, and the calculated admission of the alibi lie did not manipulate the jury. It crystallized their perception. They saw the testimony not as the truth of a grieving father, but as the final desperate maneuver of a family annihilator. The man who thought he could script the perfect defense found that he had written his own conviction. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The Murdaugh dynasty had not saved him. His own voice, captured on a video he didn't know existed, and his arrogance in thinking he could explain it away, had sealed his fate. The reality of the crime, the brains of his son on the concrete and his wife executed in the dirt, overpowered the fiction he attempted to weave from the witness stand. The manipulation had failed, and the happened reality was 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The atmosphere inside the Waukesha County Courthouse on October 26, 2022, was suffocatingly tense, a stark contrast to the chaotic theatrics that had defined the proceedings for the previous 3 weeks. The defendant, Darrell Brooks, sat alone at the defense table, a position he had insisted upon after firing his public defenders to represent himself. Throughout the trial, he had treated the courtroom as a stage for his sovereign citizen ideology, frequently interrupting Judge Jennifer Doro with nonsensical claims about subject matter jurisdiction and refusing to answer to his own name. But as the jury signaled they had reached a verdict, the combative energy that Brooks had used to bludgeon the judicial process began to dissipate, replaced by a palpable, vibrating anxiety. The gallery, packed with the families of the 6 victims killed in the Christmas parade attack, and the dozens injured fell into a profound silence. When the jury entered, Brooks did not shout. He did not demand to see the oath of office for the clerk. He sat in a suit that seemed suddenly too large for him, his eyes scanning the 12 individuals who held his fate. As Judge Dorrough read the first verdict form, concerning the first-degree intentional homicide of Jackson Sparks, the word guilty rang out with clinical clarity. Brooks's reaction was immediate and physical. The facade of the arrogant legal scholar, the man who believed he could out-talk the Wisconsin judicial system, collapsed. He bowed his head, clasping his hands over his face in a posture of shock, or perhaps a performance of it. As the judge continued to read through the 76 counts, 6 counts of intentional homicide, 61 counts of recklessly endangering safety, 6 counts of hit and run involving death, and 2 counts of bail jumping, the word guilty was repeated 76 times. With each repetition, the defendant's posture sank lower. The defiance that had fueled his cross-examinations of tearful victims was absent. In this moment, the courtroom observed the stark reality of a narcissist stripped of his control. The transition to the sentencing hearing, held over 2 days in mid-November, marked the final dismantling of Brooks's constructed reality. By November 15, the suit was gone, replaced by the bright orange of the Waukesha County Jail uniform and heavy shackles. The dynamics of the room had fundamentally shifted. During the trial, Brooks had wielded the power to question his victims. Abo, procedural right, he had exploited to inflict further trauma. Now, stripped of that procedural leverage, he was forced to listen. For hours, survivor after survivor and family member after family member took the podium. They directed their grief and rage not just at the court record, but directly at him. Brooks attempted to maintain his contrarian persona, rolling his eyes, shaking his head, and occasionally muttering interruptions. But the sheer weight of the testimony rendered his antics small and pathetic. The fear he had once commanded was gone, replaced by the collective contempt of the community. The climax of the proceedings arrived on November 16, when Judge Jennifer Dorrough began her sentencing remarks. Throughout the trial, Judge Dorrough had exercised nearly superhuman patience, granting Brooks wide latitude to ensure the record was bulletproof for appeal. She had allowed him to rant, to be removed to a neighboring courtroom, and to build literal forts out of file boxes to hide behind. Now, with the jury's mandate secured, the judicial restraint was replaced by a scathing, methodical dissection of the defendant's character. The judge's demeanor was not angry, but surgical. She began by dismantling the very arguments Brooks had clung to, noting that his attempts to disrupt the trial were not born of mental illness or incompetence, but of a calculated, malicious strategy to derail justice. Judge Dorrough addressed Brooks directly, her voice echoing in the hushed chamber. She cited the pre-sentence investigation and his criminal history, painting a portrait of a man fueled by rage and a complete lack of empathy. "You have absolutely no conscience," she told him, her eyes fixed on the defendant. She described his actions on November 21, 2021, not merely as crimes, but as the manifestation of pure evil. She noted how he had driven his red SUV through the parade route, zigzagging to maximize the carnage, striking children and grandmothers with indiscriminate malice. She recalled the video evidence where he slowed down only to verify he was hitting human targets before accelerating again. The judge highlighted his behavior during the trial as an extension of that same violence, an attempt to run over the truth, just as he had run over the citizens of Waukesha. As she spoke, Brooks attempted one final feeble counteroffensive. He interrupted, claiming he did not consent to being sentenced and reiterating his debunked legal theories. Judge Dorrough did not pause. She did not engage. She simply raised her voice slightly, overpowering his murmurs with the weight of the law. She remarked on the most striking feature of the entire proceeding, the defendant's complete inability to demonstrate remorse. She pointed out that even in his remarks prior to sentencing, Brooks had focused entirely on himself, his suffering, his confusion, his alleged mistreatment, without offering a single genuine word of apology to the families whose lives he had shattered. The manipulator's toolkit was empty. The court saw him nakedly for what he was. The sentence itself was delivered with the rhythmic precision of a hammer strike. Judge Dorrough imposed 6 consecutive life sentences for the 6 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. She emphasized the word consecutive, ensuring that there would be no theoretical possibility of release, no merging of the tragedies into a single administrative term. She then proceeded to add hundreds of years for the remaining 70 counts. In total, the sentence amounted to 6 life terms, plus more than 700 years of confinement. It was a symbolic and literal burying of the defendant under the weight of his own actions. When the final sentence was pronounced, the camera focused tight on Brooks, the man who had spent weeks arguing that the court had no authority over him was now bound by its ultimate decree. His eyes darted around the room, perhaps looking for an audience that was no longer there. The sovereign citizen script had failed. The intricate legal loopholes he thought he had discovered were revealed to be delusions. He was not a political prisoner or a legal martyr. He was simply inmate number 1122109, removed from society permanently. Judge Dorrough concluded the hearing by looking at the gallery, acknowledging the strength of the victims, and then ordering the deputies to remand the defendant into custody. The visual conclusion of the saga was stark. Brooks was lifted from his chair by sheriff's deputies. There was no final speech, no clever rebuttal. He was physically turned away from the camera and the public, the orange uniform disappearing through the side door of the courtroom. The facade had not just crumbled, it had been pulverized by the methodical application of the law. The courtroom, once a circus of his making, returned to a state of order and silence, leaving only the record of his atrocities and the finality of his judgment. The conclusion of "The State of Wisconsin versus Darrell Brooks" did not arrive with the chaotic fanfare that characterized the proceedings, but rather with the heavy, bureaucratic finality of 6 consecutive life sentences plus 762 years for the families of Virginia Sorensen, Leanna Owen, Tamara Durand, Jane Coolidge, Wilhelm Hospel, and 8-year-old Jackson Sparks. The verdict offered a necessary legal closure, though it could never repair the void left in the Waukesha community. The trial's end signaled a shift from the spectacle of the defendant's antics to the solemn reality of the grief he caused. The victims' families, who displayed remarkable restraint while Brooks interrogated them from the defense table, were finally granted the last word during impact statements, reclaiming the narrative from a man who had attempted to turn their tragedy into a platform for his own grievances. Beyond the emotional toll, the case established a critical modern reference point for American jurisprudence regarding pro se defendants. Judge Jennifer Dorrough's management of the courtroom provided a textbook application of Illinois versus Allen, the Supreme Court ruling that allows a judge to remove a disruptive defendant from the courtroom while continuing the trial. By utilizing an adjacent courtroom equipped with video conferencing technology and a mute button, the court successfully balanced Brooks's Sixth Amendment right to represent himself with the necessity of maintaining order and dignity. This dual courtroom setup has since been studied by legal scholars as a blueprint for neutralizing the obstructionist tactics often employed by sovereign citizen litigants. The trial proved that the judicial system possesses the mechanical and procedural tools to withstand attempts at sabotage, ensuring that a defendant cannot filibuster their way to a mistrial through sheer volume and disorder. Ultimately, the legacy of this trial serves as a clinical dissection of the failure of narcissism when pitted against empirical reality. Brooks constructed a physical barrier of file boxes on his table, a fortress meant to shield him from the court's authority, just as he used pseudo-legal rhetoric to shield himself from culpability. He operated under the delusion that he could manipulate the jury by confusing the record, arguing over subject matter jurisdiction, and belligerently questioning the nature of the plaintiff. However, the jury's deliberation lasted less than 3 hours. This swift rejection demonstrated that no amount of performative outrage or gaslighting could obscure the forensic evidence of the red SUV barreling through the Christmas parade. The video footage, the vehicle telemetry, and the autopsies were immune to his manipulation. In the end, the courtroom proved to be a crucible where personality disorders wither under the harsh light of facts. The defendant believed his force of will could bend the legal system, but the system bent back, indifferent to his ego and absolute in its judgment.